Okay, the fall armyworm is the common name that's used for the species Spodoptera frugiperta. This insect is native to tropical and subtropical America, and in its native range, it has also been considered a pest in maize, cotton, and other crops grown in these regions. In 2016, it was accidentally introduced into Africa, and it spread rapidly across the African continent and then moved to the Indian subcontinent, China, and Southeast Asia within a relatively short period of time. So between 2016 and 2019, it made a trek basically across the world. The fall armyworm was first detected in the Torres Strait Islands in January. Shortly afterwards, it was detected on the tip of Cape York, and then larvae and moths were found in northwest Queensland by late February, and then it was found across a larger area in Queensland in March. In late March, it was confirmed in Darwin, Catherine and Douglas Daly in the Northern Territory, and on April 1st, it was confirmed in WA from moths that were collected in traps set in Carnarvon in March. So it's been in WA since March. It's now been found in several paddocks in the Ord Valley in sorghum and maize crops, and it's also been detected in multiple locations around Broome. Last week, as you all know, fall armyworm was confirmed in Carnarvon. After the detection in Queensland in January, in February, the Consultative Committee on Emergency Plant Pests met. This is a national body, and they determined that nationally fall armyworm is not technically feasible to eradicate. Nonetheless, it is still likely to be a serious pest, and state governments continue to monitor its spread. Part of the reason this insect is considered a serious pest and why it's also not considered eradicable is because of its high rate of reproduction. A single female moth can lay over 1,000 eggs in her lifetime. And also, fall armyworm are known to feed on over 350 different plant species. However, it's important to note that fall armyworm does have preferences, and it is expected to be a particular problem in some of our major cultivated crops, including maize, sweet corn, rice, sugarcane, wheat, and sorghum. But it's also already demonstrated that it's a problem in pasture grasses and hay crops in Broome. And we are also concerned that it may be a problem in some legumes, cotton, and vegetable crops, where elsewhere in the world these have shown damage from fall armyworm. The other reason that this insect is considered an important pest, and also part of the reason why it can't be eradicated, is because it's voracious and in very large numbers can defoliate crops in a fairly short period of time. However, individually or in small numbers, it may not have a significant impact, and this is important to remember, especially as you're looking to manage this pest. The other reason that it can't be eradicated is that this insect is a very, very good disperser, and we have seen this already here in Western Australia and nationally, that these moths can travel hundreds of kilometers in a very short period of time, and unaided, and then also on wind currents. So they can rapidly spread across large areas. There is also the risk of continued invasion and reinfestation from overseas. So we can expect to get continued incursions from Indonesia as it continues to disperse. So as a result, we cannot feasibly eradicate or contain fall armyworm. The surveillance program that's currently underway relies on pheromone lures, which are placed in traps like this shown here. These lures attract the male moth. The traps in Carnarvon were like this and detected males that flew into the traps and then died. These traps as are part of a surveillance program that will continue to operate around the state as we're trying to understand and monitor the spread of this insect. And it is anticipated that the range of traps will be expanded into the wheat belt as it continues to move further south. We can potentially expand the pheromone monitoring in Carnarvon. This will need to be done in cooperation with growers. However, your most important indicator of the pest in your crops is the presence of larvae that are feeding and causing damage. The reality, though, is the fall armyworm is now here in Australia. It's in WA. It's well established. And now we are going to have to learn to live with this insect and find ways to manage it. So part of this is, a key part of this is learning to identify fall armyworm. The fall armyworm is a moth, and like other butterflies and moths, typically has a 4-stage life cycle. There are the male and female adult moths shown at the top of this image. The male is there on the left, the female is on the right. They mate. The female lays eggs, usually on the underside of the host plant, although what I've seen here in Carnarvon, occasionally they'll lay eggs on the upper surface as well. Those eggs then hatch. You can see here in the next image the hatching larvae coming out of the eggs, and you can see that they have quite a dark head and a very light colored body. The body darkens over time. There's 5 to 6 different larval stages for instars, and then you see the most mature larva depicted here on the left. The larvae on the left, the larva depicted on the left there is the one that is most damaging. They then pupate, often in the soil, and then emerge as the adult. Under ideal temperatures, which for fall armyworm around the world has been determined to be about 28 degrees Celsius, this life cycle from egg to adult can take about 30 days, but under cooler temperatures it will take a little bit longer. So what this means is that for fall armyworm, in areas that don't have prolonged cold periods, can persist year-round and will have multiple generations per year, especially if there are host plants available. So as mentioned before, there are many plants that fall armyworm will feed on. However, some are preferred, and these include our grass crops, especially maize, sweet corn, and sorghum. However, other crops listed here have been noted as main food plants for fall armyworm. So you can see some of the vegetable crops grown in Carnarvon are listed and described as favored or main food plants for fall armyworm. And then other crops have also been listed as hosts, which include these that are also grown in Carnarvon. But these tend to experience less damage and are not considered favored or main in the international listings. So what becomes really important is identification of fall armyworm. Depicted here on the top of this image are the 2 adult moths, the male on the left and the female on the right. Adult moths are very difficult to capture, and as they are nocturnal. And often if they are caught, the scales on the wings are often rubbed off and the markings that might be helpful are not clear. The male on the left, as you can see, has some markings, and these may be useful in identification. But the male moth looks very similar to cluster caterpillar, which is Spodoptera latura, a related species. And sometimes the two, depending on the age and condition of the moth, are quite indistinguishable. The female moth that you see there on the right is very nondescript, and based on morphology, even under ideal conditions, is not very useful for identification. So to get a clear identification from the adult, it often requires either molecular techniques or dissection of the male genitalia. So for the most part, it's going to be very difficult for any of us to pick up a moth from the field and identify it as fall armyworm. The eggs are laid in masses, as you can see in the picture below, and they're covered with furry-like substance, which are deposited by the female. Again, these egg masses are similar to other moths that will be present in Carnarvon. And the pupa, as you can see here, is also a very ordinary looking pupa. It doesn't have any clear diagnostic features, and often the pupae are down in the soil and therefore not easily collected. So in terms of identification, what's most useful to us is the larva or the caterpillar. When they hatch, as I showed before, they have a dark head and a very light colored body. As they mature, they start to get these spots and spines in the spots, and the pattern of the spots becomes very important with fall armyworm identification. The color of the larvae is important, and you can see that there is quite a bit of variation in the color in very young larvae. In the older larvae, they tend to darken and become a much browner color as they age and get larger. So when we're looking at larvae, there are some key features that are really important. The first one to note is on the head, and you can see this upside down Y marking that's on the head. Also important is this pale dorsal line that runs along the back of the larva, and then on the upper edge of the side there's also a light band, and then another light band lower on the side with a dark band in between, and that pattern is also important. The pattern of the spots is also key. There's typically a series of spots along each of the segments on a fall armyworm larva. On most of the segments, the spots are arranged in a trapeze arrangement, so kind of a squashed square in a way. But on the second to last segment, the pattern of spots is in a very distinct square pattern, and this is key. We can also start to look on plants to find fall armyworm larvae, and some of the damage indicators that show that they might be on your plant include these types of damage. The very young larvae, when they feed, they create this windowing pattern that you see here on the leaves. And then as they get older, they move into protected areas within the plant. In corn and sorghum and other grasses, this would be in the whorls or the joint areas where they can burrow in under the leaves and tissues. And in other plants, they might even go and rest on the ground during periods when they're not actively feeding. As they get older, as you can see here from this corn plant on the right, when they're feeding in the whorl, they're feeding on the young developing tissue, and then as that pushes out, we get this shot hole feeding damage. Again, these patterns of damage are similar to other insects. So then what you need to do if you see this is actually dig down into the plant and see if you can find the larva in the plant. This may require some destructive sampling, but it's important that you get a clear identification of the larva that is doing this damage. So when it's inside in the whorl, in the soft tissue of the plant, you can see here in this lower left-hand corner, this is a mature fall armyworm larva. It's been feeding in the soft tissue inside the plant, and they often feed and then plug the feeding holes with the frass, or the excreted waste material. And so this also protects them from exposure to insecticides if that's being used as a management. In terms of management then, a general approach, we are recommending the following: that you look at fall armyworm in similar ways as you would to Helicoverpa species, Spodoptera latura, or other armyworms that you may be managing. There are several important reasons why we recommend this approach. First is these pests are very similar in biology to fall armyworm, and they are expected to have very similar patterns of damage, and that we expect fall armyworm to also have. Some products that are used for management of these other species may also affect some suppression on fall armyworm. And we also want you to be mindful of these other species because fall armyworm, like some of the others, develops resistance rapidly, especially in frequently sprayed crops. And this is in part due to the fact that it has multiple generations per year. And I also wanted to highlight that one of the things that we expect and we want to try and conserve as much as possible are the natural enemies in your production systems. We expect that other species that are present and attacking pests in your systems, even your sucking pests or other grubs and beetles and things like that that are being attacked by natural enemies, many of those we expect will also attack fall armyworm, both the eggs, the larvae, and the pupae. And as evidence of this, from the first samples that I collected of fall armyworm larvae here in Carnarvon, I've had at least 4 species of parasitoid emerge from those fall armyworm larvae that I collected on April 1st. One of them is a little wasp, depicted here on the top right, and the other is another wasp, an internal parasitoid in the lower left there, that white caterpillar, not caterpillar, larva there. So we're recommending and encouraging you to look at the suite of pests in your crop and then treat the suite of pests. So don't just manage fall armyworm in isolation. So in general, along those lines, a management plan would be to really focus on growing healthy plants. Overseas, this has been shown to help with getting the plants to tolerate damage, not just from fall armyworm, but from the other pests in the system. And then make sure that you get a clear ID. Sometimes what we're apt to do is just look at the damage, have a quick look at the pests, and start treating without knowing for sure that you've got fall armyworm actually causing the damage. So monitor weekly, more if you can, particularly in your high value crops, and make sure you get a clear ID and know the suite of pests that are out there causing damage. Check for the egg masses, which again are shown here in this image down in the bottom left corner, and larvae in the crop. And try to get an assessment of both the abundance, how many fall armyworm are there, and also the damage that they might be causing. Focus on the numbers of fall armyworm that are in early development. and get an assessment of numbers that way. These tend to be more susceptible to insecticides as well, and also tend to be more susceptible to the natural enemies, and especially the predators and parasitoids. We expect that later instars, these are more damaging, but they're also much, much harder to manage, and that's what we're seeing here in Carnarvon right now. If you do decide to use an insecticide to manage fall armyworm or the other insects in your crop, just be aware that there are a number of special use permits that have been issued already for various commodity. There are quite a few for various horticultural commodities as well. The list is quite extensive, and we've assembled a spreadsheet that we should be able to distribute shortly to help you understand and get quick access to the information on the products that have been registered specifically for fall armyworm. There are some crops for which permits have not yet been issued. I encourage you to talk to your industry representatives about making applications for any new products that you would like to see available. Before you spray, please consider whether there are natural enemies or pollinators that need to be conserved, and actively assess whether you can use a selective or softer product if it is available. As mentioned before, fall armyworm and other pests in our cropping systems are very prone to develop resistance. Spraying heavily for fall armyworm might also lead to resistance in some of the other pests that we have, and thus we are at risk of creating a much larger problem for ourselves if we reactively manage for fall armyworm. And this is important too, because fall armyworm are often protected from sprays. And I just want to reiterate that we are seeing this here in Carnarvon, where growers are spraying and they're not seeing large control effects, simply because the larvae are protected in these areas within corn and sorghum, and so they're not getting the management results that they're seeking from the sprays. So be careful with your sprays and consider the timing of your sprays to when larvae are more active. And it has been suggested overseas that spraying in the very early morning or in the evenings might be more effective because that's when larvae are moving. There are other practices that have been used overseas that seem to have some benefit in different cropping systems. For example, trap crops and push-pull systems have been used. There are a number of biological pesticides, NPVs, for example, that are available overseas that we don't currently have available here. There are different crops that have different levels of resistance and more tolerance to fall armyworm damage. And then others are using inundative biological control with some of the parasitoids, such as the trichogramma, an egg parasitoid, and focusing on conservation biological control, manipulating things within the system to help maintain and protect the natural enemies. We're going to need to test these under Australian conditions and in our particular production systems to ensure that they are effective as well. So where to from here? I just want to reiterate, we are still in the early days of the invasion. We're just at the beginning of May. We've only really known that we've had this pest here for just over a month. There is a lot to learn. In particular, we're still learning where this pest is going to be able to live, where is it going to exist year-round, and what it's going to feed on. We need to still understand how damaging it's going to be, and in particular, what commodities it's really going to target and under what conditions it will feed on those commodities. So we're going to need to do a lot of collaborative research. Some of this is beginning, and at DPIRG, we're going to be conducting research into IPM approaches and working to fill knowledge gaps. This is going to take some time. But as we are doing that, we are continuing to develop resources and make those available on our website, and encourage you to check the website for further information. And then also the DPIRG staff in Carnarvon will send out information directly to you as it becomes available. No? All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time and your interest and your attention. And I look forward to working with you in the future as we figure out the best way to manage this pest.